Week 11 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few wide receivers I look to get off the wire this week. The first guy, Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. So a lot of fantasy owners before the beginning of the season were drafting him and hoping he would be a breakout candidate. But it did take 10 weeks and he finally broke out. And he looks like he could easily be the number one guy over here in Green Bay. I know Watson has a lot of drop issues. I know he hasn't been 100% healthy. But in Week 10 was his coming out party versus the Dallas Cowboys. 8 targets, 4 catches, 107 receiving yards, and 3 TDs. And like I mentioned, he dropped a couple good ones in this one where he easily could have had 150 yards in that ball game. So right now, a short week, Week 11, Thursday night game versus the Titans. Give up the third most fantasy points to receivers on the season. And right now, Christian Watson, he's available widely in 92% of fantasy leagues. And I think he's the top pickup at every position this week. Here's Watson. So if you need a wide receiver desperately in your fantasy league, he's a guy to go out there and get. Obviously, Aaron Rodgers has trust in him, going to him a few times, even after dropping a couple easy ones in this ball game. And he put up a 3-touchdown game, so that was the breakout he needed. Rodgers is going to rely on him. Romeo Doubs is out. Sammy Watkins was a non-factor. And it's pretty much Allen Lazard and Watson as the top 2 guys. So go out there and get them and spend at least 20-30% of your fab if you got to get Watson on your roster. The next guy's Kadarius Toney of the Kansas City Chiefs. So we saw Juju Smith-Schuster take a crazy helmet-to-helmet hit in this ball game, and he left obviously with concussion protocol problems in this one. So Toney, they traded for him a few weeks ago. We saw the potential a little bit last season with the New York Giants, but right now available in 49% of fantasy leagues, and this guy could be a great playmaker for this Chief team. A good ball game versus the Jaguars in Week 10. 2 carries even as well, 33 rush yards, 4 catches, 57 yards, and a touchdown. So right here, he's a threat. He's a guy that can run the routes. He can burn it down the field a little bit. And when you got Patrick Mahomes as your quarterback, that just helps everything as well. And we even saw Valdez-Scantling leave the ball game a little bit in this one in return. But right here, Toney's definitely a playmaker. And a guy now, as he's learning the playbook a little bit more, can help fantasy owners in a big way. And he's a guy to go out there and get this week, no doubt about it. The next guy is Donovan People-Jones of the Cleveland Browns. So Donovan People-Jones over the last 4 or 5 weeks here, he's been a great factor for fantasy owners. And a guy still under-owned in a lot of leagues, available in 65% of fantasy leagues. So coming off another double-digit fantasy game here, 4 games in a row with double digits in PPR leagues. Week 7 at Baltimore, 6 catches, 71 yards, a fumble loss. Week 8 versus the Cincinnati Bengals, 4 catches, 81 yards. And Week 10 at the Miami Dolphins, 5 catches, 99 yards. So right now, I know a tough matchup in Week 11 at Buffalo, but this guy's got to be owned, especially with Deshaun Watson coming back in Week 13 here. Watson, obviously a better quarterback than Jacoby Brissett, and could get that ball down the field to a deep ball threat as well, like People-Jones. So right now, fantasy owners should go out there and definitely give People-Jones an ad this week. The next wide receiver, I look to get Darius Slayton of the New York Giants. I know a lot of reports coming out before the ball game in Week 10 here that Kenny Golladay was going to be the man and he was going to be back, but Darius Slayton, another good ball game here, available right now in 94% of fantasy leagues. 3 catches, 95 yards, and a touchdown. I know it was a 54-yard touchdown for Darius Slayton, but now the last 3 weeks in a row here, double-digit fantasy points for him. Week 7 at Jacksonville, 3 catches, 58 yards a touch. Week 8 at Seattle, 5 catches, 66 yards. And then Week 10 versus Houston, 3 catches, 95 yards and a touch. So Week 11, a good matchup on paper versus the Lions that give up the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. And right now, him and Daniel Jones have a good rapport. Slayton's healthy, and he was a guy overlooked for other guys early in the season, like a Richie James, Kadarius Toney. They had ahead of him on the depth chart before he was injured and traded away. And right now, Slayton's going out there making plays, and he's definitely a wide receiver owners should get because he looks like the number 1 over there in New York. The next guy, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine of the Tennessee Titans. So Westbrook-Ikhine coming off probably the best game of his NFL career, even though we've seen some flashes from him last season as well. So in that one in Week 10, monster game versus the Broncos, 5 catches, 119 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He's got speed, he's got breakaway ability as well, and he showed it. But this season, he really hasn't done anything. But now with Tannehill back in the mix, at least they got a quarterback that could stretch the field a little bit, even though in Week 11, it's going to be a pretty tough matchup once again at the Packers that give up the 6th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So right now, deeper league ad, I'd rather have these other guys like I mentioned over Westbrook or Keene. Available in 100% of leagues. It definitely could have been a fluke game, but after coming off a big game like that, he's definitely a guy I got to put on this list and recommend this weekend. The final wide receiver I look to get on the wire this week here is DeAndre Carter of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Carter coming off a nice ball game in Week 10 at the San Francisco 49ers. 4 catches, 64 yards, and a touchdown. So we know Mike Williams and Keenan Allen have been out for weeks now for this team. I doubt they'll probably come back in Week 11. And DeAndre Carter, I know he's a slot receiver and not going to have huge fantasy games, but his guy is a flex option in deeper leagues or a third receiver in 3 receiver leagues. He definitely could put up 10 or more fantasy points. And Week 11, you know, this Charger team's going to be throwing a whole lot versus the Chiefs here, who do give up the 7th most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So the last few games for Carter: Week 7 versus Seattle, 3 catches, 37 yards. Week 9 at the Falcons, 5 catches, 53 yards. And Week 10 at the Niners, 4 catches, 64 yards, and the touchdown. So right now, he's making plays, good PPR guy, and available in 70% of fantasy leagues. So that's a few wide receivers I like to get on the wire here for Week 11 of the fantasy football season.